The greatest military disaster in Western history didn't just reshape Europe. It also taught 12-year-olds why you should never peak without building first. Everything you know about history class is wrong. Look, I'm gonna level with you. I spent 8 years getting a doctorate in classical antiquity, and the most valuable thing I learned is that the Roman Empire fell because they didn't know how to rotate. That's it. That's the tweet. Every textbook will tell you it was barbarian invasions, economic collapse, political corruption, religious transformation, lead poisoning, or my personal favorite, moral decay. But the truth is simpler and infinitely more embarrassing. The Romans got third-partied. On August 9, 378 AD, Emperor Valens marched his army to Adrianople to fight some uppity Goths who had been causing problems in the Balkans. His scouts had done reconnaissance. They reported around 10,000 enemy infantry. Valens had about 30,000 troops. Easy win, right? The math was mathing. What his scouts failed to notice was the Gothic cavalry that was away on a raid. You know, just casually absent from the battlefield report. So Valens engaged, his infantry committed to the fight, and then the Gothic cavalry came thundering back and hit the Roman flanks from absolutely nowhere. The Romans lost 2/3 of their eastern army that day, and Valens himself was killed. His body was never found, though some accounts claim he was burned alive in a farmhouse while hiding, which, if we're being honest, is the ancient equivalent of dying to fall damage while running from the storm. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that, "Never since the Battle of Cannae has there been such slaughter." And he was right. But what Ammianus didn't know was that 1,640 years later, teenagers would be recreating this exact tactical blunder every single match and learning absolutely nothing from it. The loot economy and why your V-Bucks are basically denarii. Let's talk about something historians don't discuss enough: the 3rd century crisis. From 235 to 284 AD, the Roman Empire had over 50 emperors. 50 in 50 years. That's one new leader per year, which makes the Fortnite meta look stable by comparison. Each new emperor needed to pay off the army to stay in power, and the quickest way to do that was to debase the currency. They'd take silver coins and gradually replace the silver with bronze and copper, then give them a thin silver wash so they still looked shiny. Under Emperor Gallienus, Roman coins had about 5% actual silver. The shine would wear off to reveal the garbage underneath. This is exactly what happens when you land at a gold supply drop and find nothing but gray pistols. Pure disappointment wrapped in false promises. By the 270s AD, the Antoninianus was essentially worthless. Prices had increased 70 times over 2 centuries, with most of that inflation happening in a single decade. Soldiers demanded payment in goods instead of coins because the money was literally not worth the metal it was minted on. Sound familiar? It should. Every Fortnite player eventually learns that all the gold bars in the world mean nothing if you don't have mats. You can have 50,000 gold, but if you're in endgame with no wood, you're about to become a spectator. The Romans learned this the hard way when their economy collapsed so thoroughly that people reverted to bartering and subsistence farming. Large landowners started producing everything locally because trade networks had completely fallen apart. They essentially went back to Farming Simulator while their empire crumbled around them. Constantine eventually fixed the currency problem by introducing the solidus in 310 AD. He minted it at 4.5 grams of nearly pure gold, somewhere between 96 and 99% purity. It was such a reliable store of value that the Eastern Roman Empire kept using it for the next 700 years, with almost no change to its weight or composition. The Byzantine solidus became the standard international currency of the medieval Mediterranean, trusted by traders from Britain to Baghdad. That's the power of consistent resource management. When people know your currency is real, your economy functions. When they know your mats are wood and not wet cardboard, you win fights. Meanwhile, I cannot convince a single random duo partner to conserve their mats for endgame. We've learned nothing. Humanity has grown 0% as a species. The testudo was just box fighting with extra steps. Here's where things get academically spicy. The Roman testudo formation was the ancient world's most famous defensive technique. Soldiers would align their shields to create an interlocking barrier, with front-row troops holding shields from shin to eye level and back-row soldiers placing shields overhead. The whole formation moved forward with protection on all sides, and according to Cassius Dio, it was strong enough to support the weight of a horse walking across the top. That's not defensive building, that's just turbo building with better upper body strength. The testudo had clear rules. You needed tight spacing, soldiers touching shoulders, overhead shields overlapping to prevent gaps. It moved slowly but provided nearly complete protection from projectiles. Roman commanders would deploy it during sieges to let troops approach fortified walls without getting turned into pincushions by arrows. Does this sound familiar to anyone else? Because I'm pretty sure I watched a 12-year-old do the exact same thing yesterday while pushing a tower in Pleasant Park. The critical weakness of the testudo was that it sacrificed mobility and offensive capability for protection. You couldn't fight effectively while turtling. At the command, "Tecombre," legionaries would break formation to engage in actual combat. This is literally the box fight reset mechanic. Build your box, protect yourself from enemy fire, then edit out and engage when you have an opening. The Romans knew this in 36 BC when Mark Antony used the testudo against Parthian horse archers. 2,000 years later, streamers are independently rediscovering the same tactical principle and acting like they invented something. But here's the thing. Just like turtling in Fortnite, the testudo had significant downsides. The sides remained exposed, making flanking maneuvers extremely effective. One well-coordinated attack on the corners, and the whole thing fell apart. Fritigern's Goths understood this. Modern Fortnite players who spray at turtle bases understand this. The circle of strategic discovery continues unbroken. High ground and the fall of Hadrian's wall strategy. Emperor Hadrian spent half of his 21-year reign traveling the empire and building walls. The man was obsessed with fortification. He claimed it was divine instruction, which is what I say when someone questions why I always take the high ground. The Roman lime system stretched over 5,000 kilometers, with Hadrian's Wall in Britain being the most famous example at 118 kilometers of stone wall, ditches, forts, and watchtowers crossing the entire width of the island. The strategy was deterrence through presence. Wherever barbarians attacked, they would find professional, heavily armed forces waiting. The walls weren't meant to stop armies entirely. They were designed to control movement, channel traffic through checkpoints, and make sneaky border crossings virtually impossible. You couldn't drive stolen livestock over a wall that high, and you couldn't move a raiding party through without being spotted by one of the many, many watchtowers. This is literally zone control. Hadrian understood that winning wasn't about killing every enemy. It was about controlling the map. Force your opponents to move where you want them to move. Fight where you want them to fight, and never let them get comfortable. Every Fortnite pro who plays Edge and uses the storm to protect their back is channeling 1900-year-old Roman frontier doctrine without even knowing it. But here's where Roman strategy failed. They built all these walls but forgot the most important part. You have to keep building. The limes was static. Once the wall was up, that was it. They maintained it, sure, but they didn't adapt. When the barbarians figured out how to breach it or just go around it, the Romans had nothing. Compare this to any decent Fortnite player who knows that building is continuous. You don't just place one wall and call it a day. You build, edit, rebuild, reposition. The moment you stop adapting, you die. The Romans stopped adapting, and they died. The Antonine Wall was built north of Hadrian's Wall in 142 AD under Emperor Antoninus Pius, extending Roman control further into Scotland. It was impressive, 63 kilometers of turf fortification with a stone base, complete with forts every 3 kilometers. Then they abandoned it. Within 20 years, the Romans retreated back to Hadrian's Wall because maintaining the northern position was too expensive and too difficult. They had pushed for map control, gained it briefly, and then gave it up because they didn't want to commit the resources to hold it. This is the ancient equivalent of building to max height in zone, realizing you're running out of mats, and having to give up all that altitude you just worked for. The Romans kept retreating to older, easier-to-maintain defenses instead of pushing for map control. They ceded high ground. In a battle royale, that's a death sentence. In ancient history, it just took a few centuries longer. Third-partying, the strategy that killed Rome. Let's get back to Adrianople because I'm still not over it. Valens had every advantage except the one that mattered: situational awareness. His scouts reported enemy numbers. They mapped the Gothic infantry position. They did everything except notice that the enemy cavalry was temporarily absent. When those cavalry units returned mid-battle and slammed into the Roman flanks, it wasn't just a military defeat. It was a 378 AD masterclass in third-partying. Third-partying is when you wait for two enemies to weaken each other, then sweep in to clean up both. It's efficient, it's ruthless, and it works. The Gothic cavalry didn't need to fight fresh Roman troops. They hit exhausted legionaries who had already committed to a fight, whose formation was broken, whose attention was focused elsewhere. That's not genius strategy. That's basic battle royale awareness. And look, the Goths weren't even the only ones doing this. Every major power on Rome's borders eventually figured out that the best time to attack was when Rome was fighting someone else. The Persians would raid when Rome was dealing with Germanic tribes. Germanic tribes would push when Rome was occupied in the east. Civil wars inside the empire created perfect third-party opportunities, and there were a lot of civil wars. Remember those 50 emperors in 50 years? Each of those transitions usually involved some kind of internal conflict, which meant the borders were left vulnerable. The crisis of the 3rd century saw the empire literally split into 3 competing factions while external enemies circled. That's not political instability. That's being in a 3-way build fight while the storm closes and someone else lines up a sniper shot. The empire survived that particular crisis, barely, but the damage was permanent. They never fully recovered their military reputation or their economic stability. Fritigern, the Gothic leader at Adrianople, had actually tried to negotiate before the battle. He sent messengers to Valens offering to talk. Valens, impatient and arrogant, decided to attack anyway, because he wanted the glory of victory all to himself. He didn't want to wait for reinforcements from his co-emperor. He didn't want to share credit. Pride killed him and 2/3 of his army. If Valens had simply waited for backup, if he had rotated to a better position, if he had shown literally any patience, the battle might have gone completely differently. But no, he had to W-key into an engagement without full information. Tale as old as time. Resource management. Why the Romans ran out of mats. The Roman military at its peak was a wood-consuming monster. They built camps every single night when marching, even if they were only stopping for one sleep. These weren't small camps either. They were full fortifications with walls, ditches, and gates. A standard marching camp for 2 legions covered about 2,000 feet on each side. That's a lot of lumber. That's a lot of farming resources just to survive the night. But this is what made Roman armies nearly unstoppable. They never overextended without protection. They always had cover. They rotated with structure. Sound familiar? The legions that won the Mediterranean did so because they never stopped building. The legions that lost the empire did so because they forgot how. By the 5th century, the Roman army had fundamentally changed. They relied more on cavalry, on foederati warriors from allied barbarian tribes, on quick mobile forces instead of the heavily equipped legionaries of earlier centuries. They traded their traditional building-focused strategy for speed and flexibility. And it worked, sometimes, until it didn't. The problem with abandoning your core mechanics is that you lose the fundamentals that made you dominant in the first place. Rome built its empire on discipline, fortification, and resource management. When they stopped doing those things, when they started relying on mercenaries and cavalry instead of their own trained troops, they became vulnerable in ways they'd never been before. The economy collapsed, partly because maintaining the army was so expensive. The debasement of currency was directly tied to paying soldiers. Every new emperor had to give an accession bonus to the troops to ensure their loyalty, and the easiest way to raise that money was inflation. But inflation destroyed trade networks. Trade collapse meant less tax revenue. Less revenue meant less money for the army. Less army meant more territory lost. More territory lost meant even less revenue. It was a death spiral, and no amount of currency reform could fully reverse it. This is what happens when you burn through all your mats mid-game and have nothing for endgame. You make desperate plays. You take fights you shouldn't take. You die in positions you never should have been in because you spent everything too early. Rome spent everything on internal conflict and had nothing left when the real threats showed up. The storm circle was real, and it was called climate change. Here's something your history teacher probably didn't mention. The climate shifted. The Roman warm period, which provided favorable agricultural conditions throughout the empire's rise, ended around the 2nd century AD. Temperatures dropped. Rainfall patterns changed. The reliable harvests that had fed Roman cities and armies became less reliable. This wasn't catastrophic by itself, but it added stress to an already stressed system. Meanwhile, on the Eurasian steppes, conditions were getting worse. The Huns, those same Huns who would later terrify Europe under Attila, were being pushed westward by drought and competition for resources. They, in turn, pushed Germanic tribes ahead of them. The Goths, who crossed into Roman territory in 376, weren't invading for fun. They were refugees fleeing something worse. The Romans let them in, mistreated them, and then acted shocked when the starving refugees revolted. It's all zone movement. The storm was closing on Central Asia, so the Huns rotated west. The Huns pushed the Goths, so the Goths rotated into Roman territory. Everyone was trying to get to the circle, and Rome was standing in the only safe zone. That's a lot of pressure on a single position. The borders that had held for centuries started to buckle because everyone needed to be where Rome already was. The environmental changes also affected Roman provinces directly. North Africa, the breadbasket of the empire, faced desertification and reduced agricultural output. Egypt remained productive, but getting grain from Egypt to Rome required a functional navy and safe sea routes. When the Vandals took Carthage in 439 AD, they didn't just capture a city, they captured Rome's grain supply chain. Controlling resources wins games. The Vandals understood this. They raided Rome itself in 455 AD, taking everything that wasn't nailed down and some things that were. That's what happens when someone else controls your drop spot. The fall wasn't a single moment. It was a series of knocked teammates. 476 AD gets cited as the fall of Rome because that's when Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, the last Western Roman emperor. But honestly, the empire had been dying for decades before that. Multiple emperors had been killed, deposed, or replaced. Territory had been lost, regained, and lost again. The infrastructure was crumbling. The economy was in shambles. The army was a shadow of its former self. Odoacer just finished what countless others had started. It's the same thing that happens in a squad game when everything goes wrong. First, One teammate gets knocked. You res them, but now you're weaker. Then another gets knocked. You res them too, but now you're really hurting. You're low on mats, low on heals, bad position, third storm circle coming in. You're technically still alive, but you're not really playing to win anymore. You're playing to survive another 30 seconds. Rome was playing to survive for about 200 years before the final knock. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call Byzantium, survived for another 1,000 years. They held Constantinople, they maintained their economy, they adapted to new challenges. The difference? They had better position. Constantinople was incredibly defensible, sitting at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, with walls that wouldn't fall for a millennium. They kept their bureaucracy functional, their military reasonably equipped, their economy relatively stable. They learned from the West's mistakes. Don't overextend, don't let your currency collapse, don't ignore the fundamentals. Western Rome didn't have Constantinople. They had Rome, which by the 5th century was not even the capital anymore. They had fragmented territory, unreliable allies, and a series of crises that each made the next one worse. The Western Empire didn't fall because of one thing. It fell because of everything. Economic collapse made military weakness. Military weakness invited invasions. Invasions destroyed economic infrastructure, and the cycle repeated until there was nothing left to lose. What Fortnite actually learned from Rome? I'm going to let you in on a secret. Epic Games didn't consciously design Fortnite based on Roman military doctrine. That would be insane. What actually happened is that Battle Royale games, by their nature, rediscover ancient strategic principles. When you create a game where resources are limited, territory shrinks, and multiple factions compete for survival, you automatically create conditions where Roman tactics become relevant again. High ground advantage? The Romans knew it. Resource management? The Romans lived it. Defensive building? The testudo says hello. Third partying? Adrianople was right there. Zone rotation? Ask the Huns and Goths who migrated across a continent. The shrinking storm circle forcing conflict? That's just climate change and resource scarcity accelerated to 20-minute matches. The Romans had hundreds of years to figure this out and still lost. Fortnite players have been at it for less than a decade and have already developed tactics more sophisticated than half of Rome's late emperors ever managed. Valens at Adrianople had 30,000 professional soldiers and still W-keyed into a third-party situation. I've seen 10-year-olds with better game sense than that. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most players don't learn from history, and history doesn't learn from most players. Every match, thousands of people repeat Valens's mistakes. They engage without full information. They commit to fights they can't win. They push for glory instead of waiting for the right moment. They run out of resources mid-game. They get flanked by enemies they didn't account for. They die to the storm because they rotated too late. Rome fell because its systems failed under pressure. Its economy couldn't sustain its military. Its military couldn't hold its borders. Its borders couldn't protect its economy. The whole thing collapsed inward. Victory Royale, on the other hand, goes to whoever learns these lessons fastest and executes them best. So what's the point of all this? The point is that strategy is strategy. The circumstances change, the technology changes, the scale changes, but the principles stay weirdly consistent. Control territory, manage resources, maintain situational awareness, don't overextend, don't get third-partied, adapt to changing conditions, build when you need to build, fight when you need to fight, know when to rotate. The Romans wrote extensive military manuals. Vigetius's De Re Militari was the most copied military text of the medieval period. Commanders studied it for centuries. And you know what it says? Don't fight unnecessary battles. Maintain discipline. Keep your supply lines secure. Build fortifications. Use terrain to your advantage. It's all there. Every single Fortnite tip YouTube video is just Vigetius with better production values. The difference is that when Romans lost, they lost an empire. When you lose, you just queue into the next match, which means you actually have infinite opportunities to learn from mistakes that killed actual emperors. That's an incredible advantage, and you're blowing it every time you drop tilted and die in the first 30 seconds. Anyway, that's how the fall of the Roman Empire influenced Fortnite Battle Royale strategies. Or maybe it's how Fortnite illuminates Roman military history. Or maybe it's just that both involve a lot of people dying because they didn't check their corners. Either way, the next time someone tells you video games rot your brain, you can tell them you're actually studying classical antiquity through an interactive medium. They won't believe you, but at least you'll know you're technically correct, which is the best kind of correct. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go practice my cranking 90s. Emperor Hadrian would have wanted it that way.